So you mentioned the kind of the third leg of your potential thesis topics about integration with other technologies.
Mhm.
That is super interesting to me, and I'm curious where you kind of see the main opportunities there, because obviously with this material itself seeming to work so well, what are some of the other like technologies that for treatments that exist now? Maybe you've even had clinical trials because they're less or non-invasive, and how do they kind of interplay with what you're working on?
Yeah, so, you know, one of the things that motivated me to like start looking at some of these things is academic research can get really siloed. And there are pros and cons to the way that we do like academic engineering research, but it's very like patent driven, like intellectual property, IP stuff. Like people, they want to develop something that will be patented. They can take that patent and make a startup out of it or whatever.
Yeah.
And there are pros and cons to that. Like, one pro, that kind of stuff can be motivating to a lot of people. It can encourage a lot of, like, it can encourage private interest in funding things like when it's around the clinical trial stage. One con is it doesn't really uh, encourage collaboration all that often. Um, and so, like, I'll talk about a couple of them in a second. Like, there are other great technologies that target the subacute phase of stroke recovery, but it's not always advantageous for people to think about how they can combine their things because they would rather stick with what they have. Um, because they have their patents around it and whatever, and then move forward. Luckily, my professor doesn't really follow that, and this person we're collaborating with doesn't really follow that to that level at least. And so, um, we uh, I guess the one that we're going to try and do is more in like the stimulation realm. And so, um, like I'm interested, or sorry, not I'm interested. The field has tried a few different types of stimulation therapies for treating stroke, and by stimulation, that can be really anything. There's a ton of different things that kind of stimulation, but I'm talking more about like uh, magnetic or electrical stimulation, like really low levels of that. And so there's both non-invasive and invasive categories like under this type of thing. And so like you can have a non-invasive thing where there's like some magnetic stimulation kind of just or electrical sort of up here. Um, that can really impact how the different brain hemispheres talk to each other. So they can control, uh, like I think, I guess post-stroke, there's a lot of like instability in how they talk to each other. And so that can kind of stabilize things a little bit. Um, there's also the more invasive stimulation therapies. So there's like deep brain stimulation, which kind of like injects something and tries to stimulate like a very specific part of the brain to do it for a particular purpose. There's cortical stimulation, which is more what we're looking at. That's where you have like a kind of stimulation area right on the motor cortex, like right on top of where, for us, that's where we apply our strokes usually for our animal models. So like right on top of where the stroke is. Um, the goal of that is to encourage the neurons to form their new connections, like the neuroplasticity part of things. Um, uh, and in theory, that's really compatible with our material. Like you could inject the material and then put the stimulation stuff on top of that, or vice versa in the order. Um, and they could kind of work together. You could even, if that worked, you could go a step further and like change the properties of the material to where it could take advantage of the stimulation there. Um, so that's really what my project is. Um, but there are a few other subacute therapies, but I think that's the main thing we're trying to do.
Yeah, kind of the main options that seem feasible, probably with kind of the direction you wanted to go.
Yeah, yeah, and part of that is that it goes back to the collaborator thing too. So we like at where I am, like there are people who do all of those different types of stimulation therapies, um, but they're all great. They all would have been great, and the person we're working with is awesome. But we worked with the person that my professor already knew well and had worked with. I don't know if they worked together before, but like knew pretty well, knew that he was like a good person and would be a good collaborator. And he had more expertise in the invasive stimulation and was really interested in the cortical stimulation. And so that's what we're going with. I honestly, in theory, all of these could be beneficial together, but that's another example of like proximity and just like who happens to know each other sparking like a particular avenue. And you also mentioned a little bit about clinical trials. So this stimulation stuff, it has a really actually interesting history in clinical trials. The cortical stimulation in particular, around like 2010, was looking really promising for treating stroke, like what we're trying to do like right now, 15 years later. Um, and this startup had a bunch of funding. All of their like animal stuff was looking amazing. They went to clinical trial. Clinical trial is divided in like three phases typically. First phase is looking at like, is the thing safe? Not even focusing that much on how well it works. Like, is it safe? Phase two looks more at the results. Phase three is similar to phase two, but like way more people, just huge, just massive. And so phase one and two looked amazing. They were really excited. Phase three tanked. And so the company like the value of the company went down like 1% of what it was, and then they sold, and it was just so since then everybody was like, no, we're not trying that again. Like that was scary. That was like there you can find press articles from the time that are like this wasn't just a failure for this company. This is a failure for like the entire field of like just very dramatic. And so I think for that reason there was some hesitation. But since the results were so promising, people are coming back to it. And
Hmm.
people have also often speculated that, well, and side note, that's really good motivation for combining that with another therapy that works well. Maybe you just need a little more to get over the hump, like that kind of thing. Um,
Hmm.
but a lot of people speculate that the reason that phase three trial failed was more about like patient selection than the actual therapy. Um, the the way that they decide at what level to stimulate someone, like what current value to like how strong to provide the stimulation to a patient, is you start at a low level and kind of increase until you see like a small response and like that the hand opposite of whatever brain side you're stimulating. And but if someone's stroke is severe enough that pathway is damaged, and so you can't see a response in the hand. And so I think what they did was whoever they could get that value from, they would kind of average that out for the people who they couldn't see that like motor response from. Um, in phase one and two, they could see a motor response from like 80% of the people that they enlisted in the trial. Phase three, I think since it was larger and they needed more people, it was like 15% of the people they could see a response from. And so the speculation is that I think early on they were like, well, we think it still works. We'll just have to average out the value. I think the speculation afterwards was, well, maybe this is really only beneficial if that pathway is still connected. And so they looked at only the 15% of people who had that response, and they did see it like a significant increase in their functional recovery in that phase three trial. But if you like threw it all together with everybody, they didn't. And so it's kind of interesting how really small things like that can like completely change what's available to patients and like what makes it through clinical trials.
Yeah, and what you just said specifically, actually, at least to me, with my very little knowledge of really the details behind this, that is like exciting to me. With that, okay, you see, whenever you have like kind of what you're saying, they postulated afterwards is that okay, maybe you have to have that connection be somewhat viable still.
Mhm.
Well, that looks like a big opportunity, like you're saying, to kind of work together and maybe bridge that gap with the injectable, where you have something local that promotes the healing and the vasculature, and then the external, like electrical stimulation or like I would whatever the
Mhm.
electrical stimulation is, internal or external, together. That seemed like a really huge, like, novel opportunity, to even my uneducated perspective on it.
No, I think it would be cool. I hope it works. It can be hard to, we work in mice, and so it can be hard to, right now we're just working on making the model. And so for all these things, for you have to start in animals because you can't go straight to, you can't just start stimulating a human with like you have to start somewhere before that. There's the way our current system is. I think ideally, just a quick note on like animal models. I think ideally the field eventually will have no need for animals. There's a lot of technology being worked on to replace animal, like the microfluidic stuff I mentioned. There are people working on developing these like labs on a chip, is what they call them, as ways to simulate complex cellular responses and cellular interactions to try and get things that um, to not have to use animal models as much. Um, Honestly, I don't think in our lifetime technology will develop enough to have no use for them, but like eventually that would be a cool thing. But right now, you start with trying to develop a model that allows injection of the material with stimulation so that you can even answer the questions you want to answer. And that's where we are now.